everyone, welcome to the sixth episode of SAE podcast. I am Ruheen and with me I have Hemant and Adarsh. Today's podcast is going to be on Concorde. So, Concorde is basically an Anglo-French supersonic aircraft. So, for those of you who do not know what a supersonic aircraft is, it's basically it travels at the speed or beyond the speed of sound. So, this was a very major development in the aviation industry because it was a 1.3 billion euro project, and both the countries and all of the investors they never really um, got their money back or they made any kind of profit because it was discontinued. Yeah, so it was retired on 24th of October in 2003, whereas the first flight of Concorde was 2nd March 1969. So, what was so special about this aircraft?
Um, so from what I know, I think it is because this aircraft was the first aircraft which went at Mach 2 and greater for passengers. It was not just it is not just for a jet purpose like for military or something. It was it was a passenger aircraft basically, and that was a really special thing back then, and everybody was just drawn to it because of how unique it is and how different it is from the regular aircrafts. And we're talking about like what, 60 years ago, 60, 58 years, 55 years ago. Back then, aircrafts were relatively newer, and at that point in time, such a new invention or creation was obviously going to take away the entire population with its might. So yeah, that's what I felt. Uh, yeah.
Even when
And
you look, yeah,
all right, and to add to that, another very interesting fact was that this was literally the first aircraft ever that was able to supercruise. Now, what is supercruising? It is being able to fly beyond the speed of sound at, at without using their afterburners or their reheaters. This is a thing that still many military aircraft to this day are not able to do, and that was done back in the 1960s. So, bravo to the French and the British.
I think this was like an engineering marvel because when you just look at the aircraft, it's not like any of the other commercial aircraft that we normally see. Like there isn't a tail, so a tailless aircraft. It has a very weird shaped delta wing, which is apparently known as a
Ovular.
ogival something.
Ovular, I guess. Isn't it
I
ovular? It's an ovular one, right? If I'm not wrong. Ovular delta wing.
It's called agile.
Oh,
It's an ogival delta wing.
oh,
an
what?
ogival delta wing.
Okay.
It's a weird kind of 3D spline.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
spline is 2D, this thing is a 3D spline.
Even when you look at the fuselage, it's like a very narrow body, long body, and then the nose. Well, is there any other commercial aircraft wherein you can control the nose as like it changes its angle in flight? I don't think so.
I
Okay,
don't.
so technically there is one, but it was never introduced for commercial. Like it was introduced for commercial service, but then it wasn't a very known one. That was the TU-144, which was again a competitor to Concorde itself.
And that
We'll
got
talk about that later as well.
I see.
did it get discontinued?
Probably. I think it wasn't. He said that it wasn't introduced as a commercial one in general probably because of the expense. I mean, to be honest, anything like that back then, especially, it would have been more expensive because uh, obviously, like there were not as many flights available in general, and taking something like that would have been
Hmm.
really, really expensive. So yeah,
I mean, when you talk about the expenses of just the development of Concorde, both England as well as France they put in like what uh, $1.4 billion or something. they each put in that much amount of money, and like for sure it was a big thing for the aviation industry, but then it had its own set of flaws.
It was too
Like it
big for
wasn't a
itself.
very commercial.
It was too big
Yeah,
for itself. Yeah.
it wasn't commercially viable.
From
And
from what I read, like about the problems in this, uh, so apparently it was also environmentally not friendly for some reason. It was using some like other than the sonic boom that it created, it was using some kind of different material which was not actually that good for the environment, because it was reducing the. I'm not sure exactly. Oh yeah, disposing of that material was very difficult in general. If the aircraft was if the aircraft wasn't using if you weren't using it anymore, disposing it off was very difficult because of the material they were using. And also again coming back to the sonic boom, the speed at which it was going, you couldn't use it in everyday areas, because or in places where there was a very busy life, like around the airports, because uh, that was a huge sound, so people will obviously get annoyed.
we have to explain the whole sonic boom thing.
Alright, so the sonic boom, what was it? How is it generated? Why is it so annoying? So a sonic boom is whenever air gets super compressed due to something moving very fast. So basically, when something is going very fast, the pressure around the point, pressure at a specific point, is going to increase and keep on increasing and increasing. That's heating up the air as well. So what's happening is, as that pressure gets dissipated, as it moves around something, it has to release that energy of somewhere. So it does that repeatedly, multiple times over a second, and with that, there's a sonic boom that's created. Now, what is that boom? It's basically a whiplash of pressure being exerted and being thrown out of that concentrated point of pressure. Now, with that came two problems. Again, as it is a pressure wave, it creates immense amount of sound, and due to the pressure again itself, that was so immense that even while the Concorde flew at 60,000 feet in the air, when it was being tested on ground, glasses of people's homes used to shatter. And leave the sound alone. That's another topic to talk about.
Yeah, that would have been very, very disturbing. I mean, it's a huge setback for something so expensive. I mean,
But what I
And that
don't
was,
understand is that, if the first flight took off in 1969 and then it was continued till what, 2003, why did they keep on, flying that aircraft for so many years when the problem could never be solved? Like
I
sonic boom,
mean,
as you.
I don't think it's about the. See, I think they reduced the flight, the flight patterns, and they adjusted accordingly so that they avoid such mishaps. Like, suppose if you take New York to London, the Concorde could go in 3.5 hours, which is extremely fast. That's how much time it takes for me to go from here to Bangalore. We're in, like, you
and
get
that's
that, right?
literally half the time that it takes for a normal flight as well.
Yeah,
A
exactly.
normal flight to UK to the US is about 7 hours across the pond. This thing
Yeah,
did it in literally half the time.
yeah,
So you
exactly.
could be there and back by the time to see sunset. You could take off from London, reach in New York, have a cup of coffee, take a flight back, and still be able to see the sunset and have some time left.
So
That is the scale of.
that's probably why I think even though it had some setbacks and some disadvantages to it, it still was successful for a decent period of time, I guess, like average.
And back to
There's
the issue, why it was not discontinued was, again, the routes that it flew were mainly Paris Charles de Gaulle to New York JFK and to Washington. Then from London it flew only to JFK. Now both the main advantage is that even if you look at the location of Paris, it's not very far from the sea. Again, same with Washington DC, New York and London. So what the people actually did, what the airlines actually did, British Airways and Air France, is they would only be subsonic when they're over land, but they would only touch supersonic speeds when they were over the sea. That way, nobody else was getting disturbed.
they just discontinued it like in 2003 after the major crash in 2001.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
2000. Was it in 2001?
One.
That
Okay, okay.
Yeah, November 2001.
Yeah, yeah. That was what
Okay,
it.
so let's just
I
let's just
think.
tell our listeners about what the crash was.
Yeah.
So basically, Air France flight of
4590.
4590,
Yeah.
yeah, it crashed shortly after it took off, and all of the 109 passengers, uh, and I guess 4 people on the ground as well, they were all killed. So, that big of an incident, a fatal incident, is what led to the Concorde being retired permanently. And out of the 20 aircraft, 18 of them are still preserved, and they are on display, I think, across Europe and North America.
Once that happened, I think that was not directly linked. People just started losing faith in Air France after that, because of which, like, ultimately it led to it. But yeah, it was that was such a devastating event in history.
That and also the fact that Concorde, despite having one major accident, had many severe incidents during its lifetime. That was another probable cause for it being retired so early in life. Although it served a good many years, but again, we don't fly supersonic today, right?
Yeah.
See, like, I know that we're not flying supersonic commercially today, but NASA and Lockheed Martin, they're working on another supersonic aircraft right now, and it's this very, very long aircraft just because, in order to combat the sonic boom ka problem, they have to increase the length of the fuselage, increase the length of the nose itself. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to see another aircraft that takes you from London to the US in 3 hours
Oh,
or
right.
something.
Fun fact about that as well. So the one with NASA that you're saying, it's collaborated with a company called Boom Supersonic. So United Airlines has actually put faith in Boom Supersonic and has ordered about 50 of those aircraft. So that is another interesting development that's happened in the recent years. So let's see. Maybe we might be flying from Delhi to New York supersonic someday.
Maybe.
How long do you think that would take? 8
On
hours?
the current time, I would assume about 7-8 hours.
That'll be fast.
Wait,
That would be insanely fast.
right
That's
now
a
it takes 20 hours.
Right now, if you go over the Pacific, it's about 15 hours. If you go over the Atlantic, it's about 14 hours.
7 hours is too less if you compare it.
no. We will go in 7 hours. It's about 7-8 hours, approx. We will. Wow. That's almost like teleportation. What? Okay. Cut.
Hey,
Cut.
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 Next.
Okay. What do we do next? Hmm.
Okay, Delta Wing we
Next
talked
was
about. We can talk about the droop snoot, fly-by-wire, and super cruising. I already talked about the engineering challenge. Are how technical do you want this to be? Quick
Not
question.
not
not
very.
not much technical. That is why I'm not at all
Uh,
touching any technical aspects right now. If you go in
We will
depth,
talk about.
yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about fly-by-wire, like basically augmentation of human inputs, and why it was required. Required basically because at supersonic things, if you have manual control and the pilot, there's even a slight error, the thing's gonna come crashing down because of the aerodynamic forces. Fly-by-wire we can talk about. We can talk about the droop snoot landing and takeoff, and hmm, and maybe about the auto landing as well. It was like, if I believe, it was the second aircraft that actually had like proper auto land after the L1011.
All right. Start. Moving on. Let's talk about the droop snoot of Concorde, which is very unique to Concorde, and I think only like very few aircrafts have this, where the nose dips while landing and taking off, the nose of the aircraft.
Well, only 3 aircraft have ever had that feature. One being the Concorde, the second being the Tu-144, affectionately called as the Concorde. I actually love that name. And the third actually being a an experimental aircraft, which I'm not sure what it was, but yes,
The
it was there as
Ferry
well.
Delta 2. Yeah, even that was the first aircraft to have a droop nose.
I see. Why do we use a droop? Why do we use it?
See, one of the major things that it does is that it will give you a better uh, view of the ground. So just to improve the pilot's view,
Yeah.
that
All
was
right.
one of the main features.
I see. All right.
And then when it comes to a delta wing, delta wing has a very low aspect ratio. So just to combat that problem also, this feature is used.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Okay, so basically I'll give the slight technical part of it. With a low aspect ratio, what you need to do is you need to increase the pitch of the aircraft to get the same effect of lift as a high aspect ratio wing would need to have. So that created a problem. If you had a straight long nose in front of you, how would you be able to see the ground while you're landing at low speeds? Because again, your pitch needed to be very high to achieve the same amount of lift that a normal aircraft would. So that is why the engineers they developed a droop snoot or a lowering nose. So while landing and while taking off, that thing would be pointed below so that the pilots had a clearer, not a very clear view, but clearer view of the runway in front of them.
Makes sense.
Okay, so why was this thing discontinued? Why would actually not even discontinued? Why did not people even fly? Why did the idea not take off? From 350 orders that were predicted, only 20 were built, out of which only 14 flew for commercial service. 7 with Air France and 7 with British. What happened?
So, the major aspect of it would obviously be the economic situations of people, because obviously going supersonic and using that much fuel would cost more. And the other aspect would be probably because of the technological advancements of the other airlines that was coming up. I mean, obviously all the airlines would want to compete with Concorde, so they'll come up with different, more cheaper. It obviously won't be that fast, but more accessible to more people, so that they can just adjust, like something more comfortable, more features, or something new. I feel that would have made people switch over from Concorde to other airlines, such that they could experience all those.
Since we're
Okay.
talking about the budget and how much money went into it and just the economic situation, when the program, like the whole development of Concorde was being discussed, originally in 1962 when the Concorde was being planned and uh, the original program cost was supposed to be around 70 million euros. Um, but because of the huge cost overruns and the delays that were happening at the time, it reached 2.1 billion euros in 1976, and because of the extreme cost and the production runs, which was just taking longer than expected, um, they sort of lost hope in the whole project. And both the companies, like both the countries that were putting in so much amount of money, they didn't think it was, the per unit cost was just impossible to recoup.
Okay, so back to the topic. So the original plan was about 70 million, cascaded into 2.21 billion. So massive failure at that point itself because of the cost overrun. Now that another issue that they had, that the Concorde had for gaining commercial success was that a lot of the countries which had ordered it, a lot of the airlines, they started cancelling their orders after 1969 when the first aircraft flew. Why did they do that? Because of the sonic booms and the people reporting that their windows were being broken and that it was too loud. So people were obviously not ready to fly it. Then governments came in and they are like, no, no flight over land for supersonic aircraft. So that happened. And again, When an initial projection of 350 aircraft became a final order of 20, something was bound to go wrong, and that is where the commercial failure happened over there. Plus, it was not cheap to fly as well. So, a normal aircraft that you would take you across the pond back in the day would fit about 240, 250 odd people back in the day. This aircraft was only able to fly 80 people, and it burned 3 times more fuel than that normal aircraft would have. So again, the airlines were not willing to bear that amount cost of fuel, because back in the 1980s, fuel became very expensive.
So the thing is that for the airlines itself, it was a very expensive project. Every single flight was just means of getting into loss. And why, like countries like US and India and also Malaysia, they all had ruled out Concorde orders, and just they had planned to order Concorde, but because of the noise concerns, there were restrictions that the government, that individual countries' governments had laid out. That is why they cancelled. Another thing that happened was that Concorde had a rival supersonic aircraft, which was the Boeing 2707. It was being built in 1971, around the same time that, no, 1971. So the Concorde was already, in the market. So what happened was that there were two prototypes that were supposed to be built of the Boeing 2707, but the U.S. government, they cut its funding. The federal funding completely closed down because of the noise concerns and the uh, all the regulations that were there at that time.
So why do you think that? Uh, okay, if in case this is a hypothetical situation, so now that there is so many flights existing compared to back in 2003, like more flight patterns, more schedules, and all that, what do you think would be the current situation of Concorde? Like if it was still running right now, what do you think would happen? Would there be any change from what happened in the past, or would there be something new or a different thing? Like I don't know,
Honest,
because yeah.
honestly, not a lot, because even aircraft today's aircraft, let's say a Boeing 777 or an A350 or a 787 that fly routes like that, they can seat about 300 passengers, give or take, a little less than that. So again, over there that's 300, and over here it's 80. Now, if you take into the factor that the Concorde burned 3 times more fuel than those aircrafts did, I don't think it would be commercially viable right now, looking at the prices of fuel at your local petrol station itself. And obviously, jet fuel is much more expensive than that. Airlines probably still wouldn't go for it. They want more fuel economy. That's why aircraft like the A350 and the 787 are popular right now.
No, I'm not
And
talking
also,
about
you have to consider
uh,
these aircraft not only just take passengers, they carry so much amount of cargo and luggage that the extra luggage fees that we end up paying. That's a major source of revenue for airlines. And for the Concorde, it it can just take 80 people. It can barely carry any amount of cargo weight. So again, the situation, even if it was flying today, would not have been much different.
And back in the day, a flight across the pond costed about what $4,000 if I remember it correctly. And that was back in the 1970s. The inflation from that time has become about 15 or 20 times. So convert that to today's money, it's still very expensive to fly for a passenger itself.
makes sense,
And
makes
people
sense.
obviously will value their money over that time.
True. Yeah, makes sense.
Oh, and also about the sales. Do you know that the sales, what both Aerospatiale and BAE systems had tried, that sent the aircraft on a group when this was introduced. So they sent it across to all the countries, including India as well. It's a little lesser known fact. That is how they tried to pitch the aircraft to everyone. And that is how they initially gained their orders. But then after the issues started to come out, people started removing their orders and governments became strict on supersonic flight over land.
That's super cool. That's cool, I guess.
Well, and also Air India was one of the first airlines to actually order the Concorde as well. And one of the last to cancel, in fact.
Damn.
because they had faith in the design. It's probably like a very big triumph in the aviation industry because they turned the whole delta wing and a flight that's going that fast into from like a military point of view to a luxury, like just something that the common man could fly on. So Air India at that time had that vision that they want to give the best flying experience to their consumers.
I
So
think.
that's why.
See, I still think that it's always gonna remain like one of the biggest aviation marvels because it's not a small joke. Like it's not a joke. I mean, for someone to construct an airplane which goes beyond uh, the speed of sound, carrying people. Like fighter jets are a different thing. A passenger plane is always going to be unique because see, I'm a Boeing fan. I like Boeing in general more than fighter jets as also because I like passenger aircrafts the most. So technically, from my perspective, it's always going to be one point that I'll dig. So yeah.
Alright, so leaving that, I am a technical guy as you might have observed, if not then yes. So I'll start talking slightly about the technical, not to bore you guys, but this aircraft was actually one of the literally first ones to have a fly-by-wire system. So back in the 1960s and 70s, aircraft still used to fly manually. So there were literal cables and pulleys being pulled by the pilot, actually from the control systems that they had, that was actuating the control surfaces, basically the rudder, the aileron, the stabilizers, and everything like that. Now, what the Concorde introduced was revolutionary for the time. It introduced fly-by-wire. So all the flight control inputs that you put, what was happening was it was being processed by computers, and computers they were taking in other data as well. They were taking into account the speed, the temperature, the altitude, and everything, and a multitude of other things. And what it was giving you was an optimal result. So basically, if you pull back, let's say with 15 degrees at the control stick, just to pull up, at 15 degrees at the ground where the air is denser is going to be much different, and where the speed is low, it's going to be much different than having an effect if you're at 60,000 feet and cruising. So the fly-by-wire, they actually it controlled that, so it minimized pilot error as well, and that thing was crucial because you were flying supersonic, and any minor problem that you had with the control surfaces going up or down could cascade into a much bigger problem. So and that was a British system. So British engineers back in the day, they worked their heads off. And it was not limited to the fly-by-wire as well. It was literally the first aircraft to have a full authority digital engine control system as well. Now that thing is technically very challenging to understand, but basically what it did was that the Concorde, again due to supersonic flight, had some problems with with air intake, because as I mentioned that pressure waves they disrupted airflow and caused that to be turbulent. And engines they need clean airflow, they need smooth airflow throughout them. So the Concorde had variable engine inlet ramps. So basically, they would open and close to steady the airflow into the engine. Now that thing could not be controlled by the pilots all the time because it needed to be instantaneous. So what that full authority digital engine control system or a freight deck did was basically control that and again a multitude of other things so that the engines performed optimally.
I see. That's interesting. That's that's something that more. I think that's something that at that point would have not been implemented by a lot of other aircrafts, obviously, as you already pointed
It
out.
wasn't.
Yeah,
It wasn't. It genuinely wasn't. Even a military aircraft, it wasn't.
yeah, exactly, as you already pointed out.
And
So it's really cool.
It was just something that was thought of for the first time and implemented.
Yeah,
And be-
exactly,
yeah,
it was literally the first aircraft to ever have it.
that's kind of cool. Very cool.
which is why even today, they display that all across, the North America, because even though it was not commercially viable, it was still an engineering success.
This is like some random
Exactly.
gem that you find out of nowhere. Like when you're digging for gold, you find diamonds kind of stuff. Because they also might not have expected to find something really cool while they were experimenting with stuff, but they just found it, probably. Yeah.
Another thing that happened was that the tire manufacturers never really addressed a very important issue that happened with Concorde. That we'll talk about the high takeoff ground speed and which led to the history of tire issues that was uh, culminating in the Air France crash. But what happened was that Concorde hit a piece of debris from another aircraft and it punctured the tire. Now, just if it had just stopped there, it would not have been a very big issue. But the tire shredded, and a piece got thrown into the plane so hard that it ruptured an entire fuel tank, and it went down obviously. So that fix, they had come up with a fix which was to reinforce the fuel tank in the by using cast iron or like cast off from the tires, but they never really got to implementing that.
As I earlier mentioned that about the tire issues, that a lot of severe incidents actually, about 70 to 80% of them were actually related to the tires themselves. Not exactly exploding, but getting punctured and getting overpressurized and causing hydroplaning problems because of an overexpanded tire. So basically what happened was that these tires, when they were filled to what they rated were, the problem was the Concorde was actually taking off and landing at much higher speeds than compared to a conventional aircraft. Where a conventional aircraft, if they took off at let's say 120 knots, the Concorde used to take off at 200. So what happened was due to that, there was a lot of rotation that was happening, and the air inside the tires used to be heated up and used to overpressurize the tire. So what these uh, engineers they came up with an idea was that they'll actually not fill the tire to the actual rated pressure, and they would actually keep it about 20 psi below the rated pressure. And while actually taking off and while landing, as the air expanded due to heating, the tires they would actually go on to the full load while they needed it at the peak performance. So that's another interesting thing. Also about the tires, they needed to be retreaded about every 20 to 30 flights, again due to the high speeds that they were flying at. And for a normal aircraft, even in today's and even back then, a normal retreading cycle was after about 200 to 300 flights. So you can imagine the amount of loads and the speed and what they did to the tires.
Which again resulted into higher prices for the aircraft, like for the airlines.
Exactly. Maintaining that aircraft was also not very cheap.
Just to give an
Flying it.
estimate to our listeners, the Concorde burst its tires 57 times before the final fatal crash. So it basically, just escaped from a disaster 57 times.
Again, and all of these incidents are actually categorized as serious incidents. Wasn't the one, these were just nails, but the final one was perhaps Air France 4590. That was the final nail in the coffin that sealed Concorde's fate.
If we talk about the safety ratings and just uh, there's no mentioning of the problems that the Concorde faced, because like even before the 4590 crash, there was like the Concorde faced so many issues, such as the debris on the runway. It got stuck to the left wing, and there was a shock wave that got created, and the whole fuel tank, the left fuel tank, that ruptured. There was just a series of problems that aircraft faced before it finally got retired.
And even for that last accident, it was actually not the tire that actually punctured it. It was actually the tire that created vibrations inside full fuel tank. And the fuel tank, because, and again, while you were moving at a fast pace, the fuel started resonating. It reaches natural frequency, the amplitude of vibrations increased. That created immense
Shock
pressure,
wave,
and
yeah.
that broke through the tank.
That was
Because again, the
unfortunate.
tanks were reinforced because it was a known issue of the tires bursting.
I mean, that was kind of lax on their part because they should have figured that something like that might happen if they used weaker tires, like not the proper standard of tires. So
So exact, so exactly that's the thing. They knew that it was a problem, and perhaps the tire technology at that time was a technical problem that they faced because of the era. But so they had come up with a solution, right? They reinforced the fuel tanks. They introduced steel plates over there, and steel is very heavy. If you're adding it to aircraft, that means you seriously need some strength over there. So combat that. So again, the tires actually hadn't ruptured it. They had just dented it, but that dent had created a lot of pressure inside the full fuel tank. And that pressure just cascaded and it punctured, and that pressure became so high that the fuel tanks could no longer handle it. That is how the thing happened, the accident. That is how the fuel tanks got ruptured.
It was basically way ahead of its time, first of all. Other than that, it was an aging fleet with very high maintenance costs, and all of the problems that it faced. It led to a lack of trust from passengers. And then, eh, fine, it was a cramped, noisy, and an expensive aircraft, but it did have an air of mystery around it, which is why it was flying for so many years.
I think what you said is true about it being way ahead of its time. I think it was so far ahead of its time that it couldn't actually it like they couldn't actually incorporate the technology that they wanted to in it properly, which is why the faults appeared. Uh, Maybe if it was thought about, I mean, if we were making it again right now, like from the scratch, maybe it would have been a different situation. Maybe we could have avoided some of the issues that were faced back then. Maybe not all, but yeah, some.
Another cool fact about the Concorde, by the way, while in flight and cruising at Mach 2, it could expand over 12 inches while in flight due to thermal expansion alone.
Wow,
About 12 inches, that's about 30 centimeters. It could expand in flight.
wow.
Is that
And there's a
real?
actually a very infamous image of pilots actually putting their caps in between the console and the wall, an engineer's console and the wall, before while they were in flight. And when they landed, that cap was stuck in there really good because the aircraft had shrunk. I don't know if the editor can put that. If he could put that, it's probably a nice touch.
Like, if we can't put it on the screen, we'll be sure to mention a link to it in the description.
Sure, sure, sure. Ooh, and also because of the thermal expansion, again, the peak temperatures could touch more than 300 degrees Celsius, 400 degrees Celsius at times.
Damn.
Again, but temperatures at that level, at 60,000 feet, were also very low. At I am not sure of the exact number, but they are negative. So just because of friction due to air, that is the amount of heating that happened. And the Concorde expanded so much.
Since you spoke about the pilots and the caps being thing, this just reminded me of another interesting fact that have you seen the cockpit of the Concorde?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
The amount
My
of
God, does it look
con-
beautiful.
it's beautiful, but the number of controls and dials in that cockpit is insane.
Crazy.
I'm pretty sure the busiest person, like during flight, would be the engineer because uh, without besides the two pilots being combined, two pilots, the flight engineers, they couldn't use trim tabs because that creates drag again, which was just unacceptable for the Concorde. The flight engineer had to continuously pump fuel from you know from the 17 fuel tanks back and forth to keep the plane level and also maintain all of the controls and the dials and switches inside. We'll put an
Yes,
image of the cockpit. It's insane.
insane. And kudos to flight engineers. Those guys they had a lot of stuff on their plates.
The pressure that would have been on them in a lot of those situations where it was at Mark 2 and they had to make sudden changes. Oh my God.
Oh, also the FADEC thing that I was talking about. It was not an actual feature during testing. It was introduced later when the aircraft actually flew first time for the commercial service. Just before that, it was the FADEC was introduced because of complaints against by the flight engineer that this thing is almost impossible to keep in optimal conditions for the duration of the flight. So yeah, that's what happened over there as well. And again, regarding the thermal issue as well, if nobody knows that, there was actually a promotional thing that happened with Pepsi. So basically, Concorde, if I'm correct, it was Air France. Basically, Air France signed up with Pepsi, and Pepsi during the 1990s was on a very fast advertising campaign, on a very expensive advertising campaign. So what they did was they actually painted one of the Air France aircraft in a Pepsi livery, and that also constituted a multitude of problems due to the high speed. Now, because that Pepsi ka primary color is blue and the entire aircraft was painted blue, what was happening was the paint that was made, it had some blue compounds, right? So due to the high speeds that it was flying at, that blue compound actually caused problem where the paint would actually flake off while flying. They had to lower the cruising speed if you were on a Pepsi aircraft.
Wait, the paint flying off, is that because of speed or pressure? Is that
It was the speed of pressure. Okay, so the paint, the thing was, the Concorde actually used highly reflective white paint normally.
yeah.
But Pepsi had a very specific blue color, right? A trademark color that they had. So for that, they added a compound to the paint. Now what happened was that compound was not very thermally stable. So as the airplane heated up, things would flake off. And that's why I believe they were limited to Mach 1.7 at maximum for while cruising. Otherwise the paint would flake off. And if they flew at Mach 2, yes, it was possible for them. It was only for about 15-20 minutes, I believe. Otherwise, the plane would start flaking off. And that thing happening is not a good thing because, again, if the paint flakes off, that's incomplete spots. It's not a smooth surface. There's excess drag being added.
Right.
And
Okay.
again, if we talk about the heating as well, the heating issues, to keep the actual aircraft cool, what the engineers had done it was that they used to circulate the fuel around the entire airframe just to keep it cool. Because jet fuel at that temperature, at that altitude, used to be very cold, about -2 degrees Celsius or something. So they just used to recirculate that around the entire cabin, around the wings, around the engines, just to keep the things cool.
So they had problems and, they came up with creative solutions to combat them.
Exactly. And that thing was, if I believe, was inspired by rockets and rocket nozzles. Although that's another deep hole that I won't go into.
Okay, one interesting fact was that, we spoke about how expensive it was and not a lot of people found it economically feasible to fly on the Concorde. There was one passenger who flew on the Concorde 718 times.
What?
So,
That's
yeah.
absolutely
So
ridiculous.
How
while
rich
many of
was that
us
guy?
How bored was
dream
that guy?
dream about, having flown on Concorde, this guy, he's from the UK, Fred, Fred Finn. Yeah. So he was an international license manager and he used to fly to the US very frequently. So he flew over the Atlantic, including, like for 718 times on the Concorde between 1976 and 2003. He actually holds a proper Guinness World Record for the most Concorde flights taken as a passenger. And he says that he's always sat on the same seat, which was 9A. Can you guess why? Why 9A?
Why?
It's because that is where the food and the drink service began. So he had enough money to fly 718 times, as well as he paid for that particular seat every single time.
Damn, that's cool.
That is only the amount of flights he's flown on the Concorde. That's probably less than 1/7 of what, like, that's probably 1/7 of what, actually, no, I've flown 1/7 of that number probably. And maybe even less than that. The total number of flights in my lifetime.
A lot of money.
Damn, that's
Exactly.
crazy though. I mean, money is a different thing. How bored do you have to be to go on the same exact flight every single time? It's just crazy.
I mean, not bored. He was a businessman.
Yeah.
I mean,
He valued his time. Maybe he wanted to do a deal across in New York somewhere, go to the Wall Street,
I get that.
have
I get
some
that.
things over there, but come back home to his wife.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Anyways, let's talk about how, well, technically, directly or indirectly, Air India was. I mean, not Air India. Airbus was uh, like it took birth from Concorde, the end of Concorde. How Concorde was one of the reasons why Airbus exists today. Um, any thoughts?
All right. Again, all right. About that, Concorde is literally the first inter-country agreement, like an international project regarding to aviation. So again, it was primarily British BAE, British Aerospace and something systems, and Aerospace TLA from France. So those two are actually the initial founders of Airbus, along with a company from Spain and Sweden. So again, international collaborations all the way. They just learned it and practiced it and ironed it from what they had learned from the Concorde, and that is actually how Airbus came to be as well, and how they built the Airbus A300, the aircraft that shook Boeing off its foundation.
That's cool.
So that it was basically the end of one aircraft and led to one of the major companies in the aviation industry right
Right now, the biggest
And if
probably.
you're in India, probably the aircraft that you fly on, and if you're in India and you fly in an aircraft, there's about a 60% chance that it's going to be an Airbus.
now. Airbus, yes.
I mean,
That is how big that company has become.
it really is one of the biggest companies in the world right now. Well, yeah, that's kind of cool, I guess.
There you go. Alright. So, deviating very slightly from the topic, people actually believe that the Concorde was actually the first supersonic civilian aircraft that had actually ever flown. To be honest, that was actually not the case. The Soviet Union were a little ahead of them. They actually built an aircraft called the Tupolev Tu-144, affectionately called the Concorde Ski. I love that name. Again, I probably mentioned it before time. And that thing actually flew back in 1968, I believe December of 1968. That was about 4 months before Concorde flew.
Yeah.
And that thing, and Russians back in the day, the KGB, was a very spy agency. And a lot of people accuse the Soviet Union and Tupolev Design Bureau of actually sneaking and copying designs from the British and the French. And if you look at the aircraft, it's actually very similar to the Concorde itself. Apart from one major change, it's almost literally the same. It has canards at the front for better high-speed control, as it did not have fly-by-wire systems.
Ah,
So
that
it's
would be a
basically
major.
the three countries, you know, trying to get their aircraft first.
True. And one more cool fact about the Concorde scale. Despite it being an aircraft from the Soviet Union, it was flown very briefly by NASA as well.
That
So NASA
NASA
used it as an experiment.
NASA chose
Exact,
Concorde over the Concorde.
yeah,
exactly. That's a very cool thing. That too during the height of the Cold War itself.
that's so risky, but kind of cool as well.
So exactly. And imagine two countries were just at each other's throats with nuclear bombs pointed at each other, ready to throw them at each other for slightest minor inconvenience that might happen. It literally flew for the enemy, for their space agency. Again, that is also, I don't know
Because
how that happened, but it's
at
cool.
yeah,
Nothing, nothing stops science and technology, I guess.
maybe.
And with
Exactly.
with
The
that,
world might come to war, but science and technology won't stop.
true. With that, I think we can put an end to this week's podcast. We'll catch you all on the next podcast by SAE. Again, this is me, Hemant, Ruheen, and others signing off. Thank you, guys.